I decided to focus on the effects of video games on children, particularly the effects of violence and gender discrimination in games. Video games have been progressively becoming more advanced over the years. They started out as simple interactive games on an electronic display and spent most of their time in research institutions. By the 70s, they made their way into arcades and started to earn the interest of the mainstream media. Soon, gaming consoles entered homes, and people started having handheld gaming devices right in their pockets. Technology became more advanced, and people began to play more complex games. However, as games became more complex, social issues began to emerge. Over the past decade, people have acknowledged the amount of violence and sexism that are a part of many video games. Scholars, feminists, and parents have started to argue and question whether or not games with violent and sexist undertones cause negative effects in children. A study by NPD Group has determined that around 91% of kids aged 2 to 17 play video games. That's 64 million kids. It's very important to understand what the possible effects of these video games are. Media can be very compelling and influential, especially to children. Their cognitive defenses against the potentially negative influences of the media are not well developed. Scholars have argued about whether or not violent video games influences aggression and if gender discrimination impacts a child's view of women. Some have argued that video games do not have the power to do these things. However, the effects of video games are complex. They could be a positive or negative influence. The effects of a video game are determined by the child in the game, and every child in every game is different. In a personal interview, Professor Lauren Woolbright told me that video games are an interactive medium that require action on the player's part, which deepens audience engagement. So, the player, in a sense, becomes the character when they play a video game, creating a different effect on the player. They control the character's actions and adopt the character's goals and motivations. When the player becomes an assassin, their main goal in the game is to kill. Or a player may play as a soldier in a war zone where the general idea in the game is kill or be killed. In Grand Theft Auto 5, the player has the chance to become an extremely violent, sexist, and unstable character. These experiences can heavily impact a young player, especially if they identify with the character in some way, shape, or form. However, becoming the character doesn't guarantee a negative outcome. In fact, it could create positive effects in players as well. Video games give players a chance to empathize and understand the struggles and experiences of others, and see the world in a different perspective. Essentially, video games are a persuasive medium that could serve to either be a positive or a negative influence. Many studies have researched about violent video games and their impact on players, and many of them speak about the negative influences. Research has shown that violent video games are associated with more positive attitudes toward violence, can lead to more involvement in physical fights, can be a signifier for later violence and delinquency, desensitizes one to violence, and decreases their empathy toward victims of violence. Professor Eugene Provenzo argues that many Nintendo video games lack any moral counterweight, and that in the world of the video game there are not very many reasons for players to behave badly in one situation, yet more positively in another. When playing a video game, one usually doesn't reflect and think about what exactly they're doing. A player's goal is usually to win the game. In order to do so, usually a player has to assault, torture, or kill certain characters. These screenshots show a scene from GTA 5 where the player tortures another character. You have a torture table full of torture tools here on the left, and the player being prompted to rip out a character's tooth on the right. Scenes like this in video games are usually required to win the game. One reason why the video game Undertale became so successful is because it challenged this idea. Unlike most video games, Undertale gives the players a choice to be merciful, a killer, or a mixture of both. As a result, players recognize the consequences of their actions. That's usually not the case in most video games. Another side of the argument may declare that violent video games have proven to be more of a positive impact than a negative one. That might be hard to believe after what you just heard, but there have been studies that don't just focus on the negative effects of gaming. A psychologist named Christopher Ferguson created a meta-analysis and claimed that there isn't a relationship between violent video games and aggression, and violent behavior may simply be a byproduct of family violence. Instead, Violent video games have shown to increase visuospatial cognition. Players who play violent video games perform faster visual reaction times, improve target location, and mental rotation. Researchers may declare that the negative influence of video games has been overstated, and that violent video gaming is instead more of a positive influence. While violence in video games can be seen as a negative or a positive influence for children, each child experiences violent video games differently. A child prone to aggressive behaviors is going to feel the effects of violent gameplay differently than a non-aggressive child. It is also unlikely that a naturally non-aggressive child is going to adopt aggressive behaviors after being exposed to violent video games, short-term or long-term. Other researchers may disagree and refer to the social learning theory, the theory that people learn from one another through modeling, observation, and imitation. Modeling and imitation is frequently seen with children. Scholars believe when a child is exposed to violence in video games, they are more likely to adopt aggressive behaviors. However, this result depends on how much violence a child is exposed to and how likely they are to participate in aggressive actions in the first place. As a child, I would play video games that had violent themes of some sort. However, video games never made me feel or act aggressive. In fact, my brother played a lot more violent video games than I did, but he was always considered the mellowest of the family. However, we were not free from some of the effects of video game violence. I feel that over time, I became slightly desensitized to violence, and exposure to violence in the media almost became normal. On the other hand, my two youngest brothers have been affected by video game violence a lot more. When they are not physically fighting, my younger brothers love to enact battles and imitate scenes from video games with each other. I noticed that violent video games impact each child differently and serve to be both positive and negative influences. Scholars and gamers have also been concerned about how gender discrimination in video games affects children, especially young girls. In video games, women have been constantly portrayed as either damsels in distress, sex objects, or both. There have also been very few primary female characters. Most video game protagonists are male. Female gamers have grown up with few positive female role models. Researchers have argued that prolonged exposure to games with sexist undertones could convey the message that females are the weaker sex and that female characters are not as important as male characters. Others believe sexism in video games could also reduce empathy toward female violence victims and discourage women from playing video games, which may be related to why there are not very many female game developers. However, similar to violence in video games, gender discrimination can impact a child in different ways. It could significantly impact one child and slightly impact another. Other scholars may argue that even being constantly exposed to sexism in video games cannot affect one's perception of women. The cultivation theory, the theory that more time someone is exposed to media, the more likely they are to believe social reality portrayed in the media, has been a major focus in studies on gender discrimination in video games. In his study, researcher Johannes Breuer found no evidence of cultivation effect on sexist attitudes. He states that similar to what has been suggested for aggression, it is likely that there are factors such as personal experience and family and peer influences that affect the development, proliferation, prevention, or reduction of sexist attitudes more strongly than fictional media content. While other factors definitely do impact one's perception of women, other research has shown that video games can also be very influential. Again, some are more prone to the effects of gender discrimination in video games than others. Each child experiences the effects of sexism in video games differently. As a child, video games gave me the sense that gaming was for boys. I noticed that a lot of the games I played involved saving a princess. There are also very few playable female characters. Gender discrimination in video games made me feel excluded and at times insecure about myself. I figured that I must have been a tomboy. However, sexualization of female characters didn't bother me until I was a teenager. Some of the sexualized characters that I was exposed to were strong, capable, and sometimes even playable. As a kid, I was too excited to finally play as a strong female character to notice or be affected by the issue of sexualized characters. This may not be the case for every player. Every player experiences different effects of gender discrimination, which is why it's so important to be cautious of what children are playing today. Again, the effects of video games depend on the game and the child, which is why studies have shown such mixed results. Video game effects are not black and white. Violence in video games does not cause aggression per se, but rather has the potential to desensitize one to violence or decrease their empathy toward victims of violence. Violent video games also have the potential to not do these things. Gender discrimination in video games can give off the impression that video games are for boys, can damage a young girl's confidence, and can affect a child's perception of women. Some children might not be affected by gender discrimination in video games, just as they might not be affected by video game violence. But simply ignoring the possibility is probably not worth the risk. This is why it's vital for parents and guardians to monitor children's gaming habits and help educate them. Children are constantly learning. It's best that they learn from parents and guardians rather than from the media.